So, good morning, everybody. This is Tom Wilder with the North Carolina Department of Labor, and welcome to our webinar today on Subpart Z, which is toxic and hazardous substances. Today's webinar, for a lot of you who have never been on these webinars, this webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours, but we may run short, so regardless of how long we take, you'll get a 1.5 hours credit, which you can use for certifications such as your mesh certification. So again, we'll be scheduled till 11:30. We'll see how we go on the time. A good many of you already know me, but again, my name is Tom Wilder. I'll be your instructor today on Subpart Z. In addition to attending this course, you can go to labor.nc.gov and OSHA.gov for more information on this subject. And again, for people that don't know me, I've been with the Department of Labor about a little over 6 years, and prior to that, I worked 28 years in various safety training and quality management positions in the textile, machine assembly, and pharmaceutical industries. Most of those years were in pharmaceutical manufacturing, from which I am retired. So sometimes in these webinars, I'll give you some examples from my experience. Like I said, I usually give pharmaceutical examples since that's where I spent most of my career. For those who are new to our webinars and Webinato, our tool, look around and try to limit any distractions. So if you've got an office, you want to close the door, turn phones off. In a cubicle, you might want to use headphones and put up a do not disturb note. And the tool we're using today is Webinato. You'll see PowerPoint slides in the middle of the screen. I'll advance those as we work through the class. Now, while we're going through the webinar today, you can maximize the PowerPoint slides. There's a little maximize button on your screen or icon. When you maximize it, it cuts your chat off, but you can go back to your minimized screen for chat, but you can maximize and minimize those slides. Now, in the bottom left corner, you'll see an emoji. I'm not going to use that because we have a large class and there are more people than I can see on the screen at one time. So I will not be using that emoji that would show whether you agree, disagree, have a question or weigh, all that. I will not be using that tool. But the chat box at the bottom I will be using, and a lot of you have been chatting as well so far. And you'll be using that. And if you don't see it, scroll down to the bottom of your screen, and you should see that chat box and the place where you'll type comments or questions. Now, for this course, you have to attend 80% of the time to get credit, and we can't give credit to people who are not registered. So if you have people sitting around you, they won't get credit because they're not registered. So just let them know that. Only the person that's logged in and registered will get credit. You'll get your certificate electronically within 3 weeks. Otherwise, you'll give our administrative person, Dee Bryant, a call at 919-807-2877. It looks like we're all set for our webinar. We got all the preliminary stuff out of the way. Again, good morning to everybody. And today we're going to cover Subpart Z. And we're just going to introduce you to Subpart Z. As many of you know, if you're holding a reg book, and I would advise if you have a 1910 Journal Industry book nearby, go ahead and grab it. It will help to have that regulation book with you as we go through the topic. But if you look at Subpart Z, it's about 38% of your book. So in my reg book, it's about 312 pages. So today, instead of trying to teach the encyclopedia to you, so if we call Subpart Z the encyclopedia, I'm just going to talk about how to use it and some high-level information about Subpart Z to give you a high-level overview and basic understanding. And at the end, we're going to go and talk about methylene chloride. We want to use methylene chloride as an example in Subpart Z. So when you go through methylene chloride, you'll see that it's laid out pretty much the same as a lot of other chemical substances or chemical elements like lead or silica or some of those. So if you're already a safety expert or industrial hygienist, This should only affirm what you should already know. But for those of you who are new to Subpart Z, it'll make you more familiar with this particular subpart. Okay, that's a lot of preliminary information. Now let's go ahead and talk about an example. Let's pretend that you want to open a business and your business is restoring and refinishing rusty antique metal furniture and collectible items. So you're opening a business, you want to restore metal furniture. Your friend advised you to use hydrofluoric acid in your process, which is known to be a great rust remover. What should you do? You're opening a business, you need to remove rust. You have a friend that says you should use hydrofluoric acid. Okay, this is a chance for you to type in, this is your business. You have a friend asking you to use HF in your process. What are you going to do? Okay, Joshua, fantastic. You're going to review the SDS, MSDS, Eileen, safety plan, SDS. Okay, that's a great answer. Let's say you have a container of hydrofluoric acid right there on your site. What's the next thing you're going to look at? You got the container there. Labels, that's right, Joshua, Jason. You're going to look at the label. Now, you may also look in Subpart Z. Does it have its own OSHA standards? Let me ask you now, does hydrofluoric acid have its own standalone OSHA standard? Some of you know, some of you don't. You might have the book in front of you. Does it have its own OSHA standard? I'll let you go ahead and type in an answer there. Okay, actually, it doesn't have its own OSHA standard, but it is in Subpart Z. So, like silica has its own OSHA standard, telling the exposure limit and everything you need to do to safely work with silica dust. But hydrofluoric acid does not have its own OSHA standard. So you want to look it up in Subpart Z and you can't find it. You're looking for hydrofluoric acid. So what you have to know is a synonym for hydrofluoric acid. Now this is kind of an advanced question. Does anybody know the synonym, another name for hydrofluoric acid? This is a bonus question. If you, too bad I can't give you a prize if you get it. We don't have prizes. But what's the synonym for hydrofluoric acid? And maybe nobody knows on the webinar. I don't know. Does anybody know what else it could be called? Well, I'm going to tell you because everybody seems to be drawing a blank. It's hydrogen fluoride. And I'll go ahead and type that in. The hydrogen FL. Kind of hard to type here. O-I-D-E. Hydrogen fluoride. Okay. Okay, it is in the OSHA standard. So what you would do is you would go to Subpart Z and you would go into 1910.1000 and you would look in the Z table for hydrogen fluoride. So just like I'm doing right now, you would be flipping through the Z table and it says there's a little 2 there. So what that does is bump me to table Z2 and I see hydrogen fluoride. Now, some of you may have been able to follow that in your book. Can anybody tell me what the time-weighted average exposure limit for hydrogen fluoride. Anybody? Oh, perfect, Byron. 3 parts per million, Warren. You guys are really on the ball. Tracy? Yeah, it's 3 parts per million. Okay, so you got to make a decision. Angie, you've all got it. Cornelia, Tracy, you got your information. You look at a label, you look at the safety data sheet, and you look at the OSHA standard for exposure limit. Now the OSHA standard, all it has is there's that number. So you're going to rely mainly on that safety data sheet. Now, those of you who know hydrofluoric acid, just knowing what you know, would most of you use that? For those of you who know HF, would most of you use that for just rust removal? Nabsnid. Byron, that's a quick no. Pamela, no. Hydrofluoric acid, and Tracy, thank you, Jason. Hydrofluoric acid is one of the most dangerous chemicals you could ever work with. Oh, it does a great job of removing rust, but if you were splashed with it, there's a good chance it could kill you. So if you're looking at the safety data sheet, and I've got one I printed out right beside me, under skin it says may be fatal if absorbed through skin and penetration may continue for several days. I mean, it's extremely dangerous. So as a professional safety person, you're going to say there are probably some other chemicals that will remove rust that are much more safe. So in the hierarchy of controls, this is for our safety experts out there, the hierarchy of controls, we can't eliminate the need to remove rust. So what's the next thing down that we're going to do if we find another chemical that's safer? What's that called? Substitution, Christina. Perfect answer. Thank you. We're going to substitute a safer chemical. So then we're going to go down the hierarchy of controls, and we're going to look at engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment if required for the chemical that we end up using. So here's a case where you got a chemical, you say, does OSHA have a standard for it? Yes or no? If it does, what's in the OSHA standard? We got an exposure limit. But here's a case where you're really going to be depending on that safety data sheet in the label to make your decision. In fact, a lot of companies, especially big companies, what they'll do is they have controls on the ordering of chemicals. And I've worked for companies in the past where there are checks and balances on the ordering of the chemical. They wouldn't even want it in the facility. So thank you for working with this little example today. That's just a little simple exercise in Subclass Z. Now what we'll do now is something I like to do in all my webinars, is we're going to do an instant poll. So today I'm going to go to instant poll, and I'm going to ask you, what's your experience level with this topic? Subpart Z, toxic and hazardous substances. What is your experience level? And we're going to share the results. And let me go ahead and start that. Let's see how my class is falling here. Okay, I got 24 beginners. I got seven intermediate and 2 advanced people. And for those advanced people, I appreciate your questions and comments. And I may have world experts out there. So we've got a lot of beginners, and that's fine. So we're going to be teaching to the lowest level here in class. So as you can see, we do have a mix of expertise with this topic. I'm going to go ahead and stop that poll and close that for everybody. And I want to do the other one that I like to do. is professional safety experience. How many years of professional safety experience do you have? Let give you a chance to enter your safety experience. And that's always fun for me to look at as a trainer. I always like to see how our folks are falling in the safety field. So it looks like right now we have about 12 folk that are beginners in EHS, and everybody was at that level at some point. And some people in the 1 to 5, and then we have some senior people 5 to 10 and greater than 10. So we have 12, 14, 7, and 5, and some people that did not respond, which is fine. So let me go ahead and close that, and stop that, and close it for everybody. So we can go ahead and get going with the topic. All right, finally going to go to the next slide. Now the good news today is I don't have all that many slides, so don't worry about us running up past 11:30. We should be able to finish on time. So again, don't worry about that. So today we're going to introduce these toxic and hazardous substances and show you where to find information, understand what a PEL, permissible exposure limit, is and how it differs from a TLV, REL, and idlh, and be comfortable with the information that you see in the subpart. Now, when we look at Subpart Z, and like I said, it's 38% of the regulation book. It's a huge part of the book. You start off in air contaminants, and that's where you'll see the Z tables. So we'll be looking a little bit more at the Z tables later. And then we come down to asbestos. I mean, we do entire training sessions on asbestos. We won't talk much about asbestos today. And then you see coal tar pitch volatiles and 13 carcinogens. And then you get into some really, for most people, weird chemicals that some people don't know what they are or never seen it or used it. So we'll go through those. And then as I go to the next slide, we keep going down the list to things that people may or may not be using. And I want to make sure I keep up with where I am with these slides. And like I said, we see inorganic arsenic down there that may affect some of you. Now, on this slide, we're starting to get into some of the real common areas for many of you. If you're a safety professional, you need to know about access to employee exposure and medical records. Now, we're not teaching that today, but if you went to that section, it would define what a medical record is, who has access to it, and how long do you have to hold on to that medical record. Now, generally speaking, talking about medical records, unless specified by a particular standard, these medical records, how long do you have to keep them? Now, I know some of you know that. How long do you have to keep some of these medical records actually that are defined in 1910, 1020? How long do we have to keep those records? Okay, Joshua has the correct answer. We got a winner. We got several people. Now, 3 years, you didn't know, but it's 30 years beyond employment. So that's a long, long time. So if you want to know about those medical records that you have to keep, because if you have people in respirators, you've got medical records. If they're under medical surveillance, you got medical records. There are all kinds of medical records that you need to know how they need to be kept and who can actually look at those. So that's all I'm going to talk about right now for medical records, and then we go down to lead. Now, lead in North Carolina is a special emphasis program. People that work with lead are injured at a higher rate or have illnesses at a higher rate than normal at normal employment places. So lead is a focus of ours. So right now with lead, if you're in the manufacturer of batteries or radiators, or if you work at a firing range, you may have lead exposure. The next one's hexavalent chromium. It's also special emphasis in North Carolina. And these two we have a separate presentation for. But hexavalent chromium is generated when people do hot welding or hot work on stainless steel. So hexavalent chromium is dangerous. And then we go down cadmium, and then we come down to benzene. Now, what common chemical mixture or chemical substance? What do you use every week that has benzene in it? Benzene. Gasoline, Byron. You're exactly right. Gasoline. So gasoline. When you're pumping gasoline, you might see a health warning on the pump for benzene, because that benzene is an aromatic hydrocarbon. It's put in gasoline to boost octane. And early in my career, believe it or not, first time I worked for the state, this is before pharmaceuticals, I was a fuels inspector for the state. So I learned about what gasoline is and what it is made of. But benzene, like I said, is an octane booster. So your dose and exposure to benzene from pumping gasoline once or twice a week is not going to be the same as somebody who may be working at a refinery or at a fuel terminal where trucks are loaded all day. So benzene, or if you work in a lab or laboratory, you may have some potential exposure to benzene. Now, coke oven emissions, skip down to bloodborne pathogens. Another huge standard for our medical folks, our collateral duty first aid responders, bloodborne pathogens. That's it's a presentation that we give. It's a training class in itself. Cotton dust. Moving on down, let me skip to the next page. Ethylene oxide. Now, in industry, ethylene oxide, what is ethylene oxide used for commonly in industry? Does anybody know? Otherwise known as ETO, ethylene oxide gas. That's right. So what is it used for? Okay, welding. All right, good answer. What manufacturing industry uses ethylene oxide? Manufacturer of, and I'll go ahead and give you the answer, pharmaceutical products and medical devices. Ethylene oxide is one way or form of sterilization. So somebody may work in a facility where they do ETO sterilization, and ethylene oxide is highly regulated because it's quite dangerous if it's not controlled. Okay, let's skip down to formaldehyde. What industry? Where's formaldehyde common? What kind of products? What kind of products? Mobile homes. That's a good answer. Woodworking. That's right. Now the mobile homes, you can have the cabinets, and Byron says carpet. Good answer. A lot of these industries have formaldehyde. The mortuaries, preservative and animal dissections, biolab, plywood. Oh, these are all great answers. And I must admit, are these campers? Good answer. Preservation. When I was in college back in the old days, and I was a zoology major, we had to dissect a lot of animals in the laboratory, and they were just soaked in formaldehyde. And there was a bit of exposure there to us. And when we're cutting those animals up, these dead animals up to study, we would be almost tearing from this formaldehyde. So anybody that's ever been around it and worked with it, you know what it's like. But it's pretty highly regulated today. Okay, skipping on down, you'll see methylene chloride highlighted. That's the one we're going to look at later. Then we have ionizing radiation. So, like I'm looking at a chart of radiation, and ionizing radiation is typically ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. So if you work with X-ray technology, that's regulated, as you know, when you go to the dentist office or hospital. That's highly regulated, and we don't want people overexposed to radiation. And what does radiation do? For one thing, X-rays out of control or too much radiation could damage your DNA, for example. That's one thing that radiation, this ionizing, can do. Now, non-ionizing radiation, which is not listed here, that's your radios, televisions, microwave ovens, power lines, some heat lamps. Those are your non-ionizing, and your laser pointers, those kind of things are non-ionizing radiation. Okay, moving down to HAZCOM. HAZCOM is huge. That's a training subject in itself. We're not covering HAZCOM today, but it is part of Subpart Z. And then 1201 is retention of DOT markings, placards, and labels. So what OSHA does, they have a little section there in the standard. It says pretty much that when you receive chemicals, the standard, it says pretty much that when you receive chemicals, they need to be properly labeled, and those labels aren't to be removed from the packing material until everything is safe and the container is emptied. I'm talking about the shipping container, or the box is emptied and everything's safe, and you got the container under your possession. And you know, as you ship materials out, you have to properly mark in your containers and fill out paperwork for DOT requirements. So there's a little bit in the OSHA standard about retaining those DOT markings, placards, and labels. Now the next one is really big, because I spent a large part of my career in the laboratory in the pharmaceutical industry. And this standard is occupational exposure to hazardous chemicals in laboratories. And what I call that is HAZCOM on steroids. So it's HAZCOM to the nth degree. Now, this is one important thing for you to learn today, which some of you may or may not know. But when OSHA typically talks about laboratories in the OSHA standard, generally speaking, and the ones that relate to 1450 here, these are labs that go beyond normal production support duties. So you could have a manufacturing plant, and you could have a little tiny laboratory, and all you do is take samples from the production process and test those to make sure everything's okay. You don't do any research. You don't do any special studies. All you do are a quality control test for release of final product and test of intermediates, raw materials, and processes. If you have that kind of laboratory, 1910, 1450 does not apply to you. Now, your company may say, hey, we want to be best practice. So you could require that for your company, but if it's out of scope for OSHA, you know, they're not going to worry about it if it's something that's not in scope to the standard. Now, let's go to the other side. Let's go to the people that this does apply to you. I'm in a pharmaceutical laboratory. We're testing raw materials, intermediate, and final product, and we're doing special studies And we may, in this lab, we may do some research. So if you start going beyond normal production support, then you're in the scope of 1910-1450, which says you have to have a chemical hygiene plan. You have to review it annually. And there's all kinds of stuff in there about how to be safe in a laboratory with your fume hoods, things about working alone, how handling accidents, all the different things as far as training is concerned. If you have a sophisticated laboratory, you're not going to pull a bunch of people from the street to work in there, because if they do and they don't know what they're doing, they can either blow up the lab or burn the building down. So you got highly qualified people working in there in a very controlled environment that's controlled by the requirements in 1910-1450. Okay, so I beat that one to death. So now, let's see where I am. Okay, let me go back. I'm going to go back to the slide before for a second. One thing that's not on the slide before that we need to update, we need to update this presentation. What standard is brand new? Here's another good question. What standard is brand new? And the number is 1910.1024. That does not apply to most companies and most employers, does not apply to most people. The brand new standard starts with a B. Starts with a B. B, yeah, beryllium, thank you. Beryllium, Christina, Eileen, Jessica, thank you. So when we update this presentation, we'll be also listing the beryllium standard there as well. Okay, now, like I said, we're going to talk about methylene chloride more. Now this slide is also missing one that needs to be updated. This is another new OSHA standard that just went into effect for industry. And it's a big deal for a lot of companies. 1910.1053. What is that? It's a new OSHA standard for construction and general industry. It's something you see a lot. Okay, Jessica, great. Respirable crystalline silica, Eileen, you got it too. So like I said, that would be listed on this slide, and we'll be updating this slide when this is revised again. And the silica has an action limit of 25 micrograms per cubic meter and a permissible exposure limit of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. Okay, so we do a lot of training on silica, and like I said, we're not training on that today, but I just wanted to mention it. Okay, so let's move on. Now, these chemicals, of course, are present in different forms and have different health effects. And we have examples listed there. Dust could be like regular dirt. It could be sugar dust, like a sugar processing plant. It could be wood dust. It could be silica dust. So lots of different types of dust. You have mist. Now fumes. Now, in the general public out there, people that aren't chemists and they're not safety professionals necessarily, they use the terms fumes and vapors interchangeably. Well, technically speaking, they should not be used interchangeably. Now, let's say you're a welder and you have welding processes. Would that produce fumes or vapors? Welding. What do you think? Fumes. That's right. Fumes. Now, fumes typically, what do fumes typically contain that vapors don't typically contain? Fumes contain, okay, particles, that's a good answer. But beyond particles, what type of particles? Made out of what type of elements? Metal. Fantastic. I'm looking for metal. Okay. So if you're talking to your next door neighbor and they say, wow, it was a hot day. I opened my gasoline can and I was getting a lot of fumes coming out of there. Well, if we were being technical about it, we're going, well, you're probably smelling vapor, but you're probably not smelling fumes because there's most likely no metal in that. Now, the old days, a lot of gasoline had tetraethyl lead additive in it to boost octane, lead. But gasoline typically does not have metal in it unless there's some additive added to it that has it. So you have things that have vapors and things that have fumes. So that's the difference between vapors and fumes. And then, of course, you have chemical mixtures. Now, with health hazards, and this is almost like going through HAZCOM again. You have things that make people essentially sick very rapidly, acute, which means right away, versus chronic. Skin corrosion, eye damage, respiratory sensitization. I'm going to give you, let me see if you know an example of something that's a big sensitizer that's highly regulated by OSHA. And I'm going to tell you what it is, spray foam insulation. Spray foam insulation. If you're in construction and you're building a building, you may be using spray foam insulation, which is a huge sensitizer, which can cause dangerous asthma. Does anybody know what type of chemical that chemical group is called? That starts with an I. Isocyanates. Matthew, you get a gold star. Isocyanates. So when I think about respiratory or skin sensitization, which is a hard word for me to say, I think about isocyanates. And if you're a homeowner and you go to the home improvement store and you buy products like Great Stuff that you spray around your receptacle to insulate around it, your dose and exposure aren't going to be very high. But if I'm using that same type of material and I'm doing a whole attic or wall, big difference. So you have genetic defects, cancer, reproductive effects, chemicals that affect organs of our body, or chemicals that can be aspirated or breathed in. Pretty standard stuff here. And let's go to the next slide. So, as you already know, you can have exposures through your skin. It can be from skin contact. It can be absorbed in my skin. I can breathe it in, or I can ingest it. It's kind of like I'm eating it. Now, most people in the workplace, they're overexposed to chemical through ingestion. Most of the time when you investigate those cases, they just didn't decide, you know what, I'm going to eat that chemical right there. I know it's dangerous, I'm just going to eat it. Well, most people, unless they're trying to kill themselves, most people don't intentionally try to eat dangerous chemicals. Now, how do most people inadvertently consume dangerous chemicals? This applies to a lot of employers. How do people ingest chemicals at work? I'm not talking about children. I'm talking about adults. There we go. You can get it from drinking or not washing hands. We're talking about hygiene. So the OSHA, and like I said, no personal protective equipment. You don't have PPE on. You take a break. It's transferred to your food, and then you eat the food. So some of the OSHA standards are very strict. It says you shall, have proper cleanup hygiene areas, change clothes. Some of them have you change clothes, shower, whatever, before you go eat lunch. Now, back in my laboratory days, I worked in the lab. We had a lot of dangerous stuff in the lab, a lot of dangerous chemicals. Typically in a laboratory, this will be in your chemical hygiene plan if you had one. If I have a lab coat on, when I leave the lab, I'm going to hang that lab coat, hang it up, because some of what I was working with could be transferred to the lab coat, which could end up being transferred to food if I wear that lab coat to lunch. So a lot of companies say, if you leave the exposure area, your lab coat, your PPE or whatever, you're not going to take that to lunch with you. People that work at firing ranges, you'll find, we're talking about lead. If there are no controls in place, lead can be easily transferred to food that they're actually eating. I'm talking about employees that say they're cleaning up a firing range, for example. Now you can go into your eyes or mucous membranes, or it can be injected. Now injection in a workplace parenteral means through a break in the skin or a cut. Injection could be through some accident where your skin is cut by glass or whatever that has the substance on it, and it transfers it straight to your bloodstream, which is pretty dangerous. It's one thing to ingest a chemical, but to introduce it straight to your bloodstream, that can get, of course, more dangerous. Okay, now there are resources out there for you from OSHA, NIOSH, the Pocket Guide. Now NIOSH, they're part of the Center for Disease Control below, but between them they have a lot of information. And NIOSH, I tell people, kind of like does research for OSHA too. So a lot of the studies are done by NIOSH. And then the safety data sheet, which we've already talked about. Now, for those of you brand new to this subject, now we probably have some industrial hygienists out there that know all this already. There's some terminology. So you'll see a permissible exposure limit. So if your company uses a chemical that is hazardous, you're going to do an evaluation of the area. You're going to do hazard assessment of the air to look for the levels of a particular dangerous chemical. And in many cases, for what we're talking about today, you're going to use an air sampling pump and put that on an employee, and that's going to follow them around all day to see what their exposure to a hazardous substance is, a hazardous chemical. But for those chemicals, for most chemicals, you look in the OSHA standard, there's a permissible exposure limit. And if it's a PEL, it's typically an average of 8 hours. So an employee is going to wear an air sampling pump for 8 hours. The cartridge or the media is going to be sent off to a lab. They're going to get an answer to make sure that employees aren't overexposed. If the levels are too high, you're going to try to engineer out the exposure or end up putting your employee in personal protective equipment, say like a respirator. Now, like I said on the slide, if you look at the tables in the OSHA standard, there may be a skin designation, like a chemical is very dangerous as far as skin contact. You'll see that on the tables in the OSHA standard. Now, there are also PELs out there in the safety world for noise and radiation as well, and no PELs for biological hazards, such as mold and bacteria. Now, this slide here shows recommended limits, recommended or guided. These are guidance limits. OSHA does not cite to people that exceed these limits, but these organizations, they've done such studies. which sometimes set a more stricter standard than the OSHA standard. So you'll see a TLV, you'll see a PEL for a chemical, and you'll see a TLV, threshold limit value. So OSHA regulates the PEL, and all these other ones are suggested. Now let's just say you work for a company, and let's say out in your production floor, you manufacture something, and let's say you use alcohol, some sort of alcohol, out there in the production area. Now, what could happen is you could have employees coming to you saying, you know what, I can't stand it out there. I get headaches. It's making me sick to stand out there in production because of this alcohol we're using. Now they could be getting sick and having headaches, but do you think they might be within the permissible exposure limit? Do you think they might meet the OSHA standard even if they're getting a headache? What do you think? Do you think they might be below the limit? Yes. Good answer, Matthew. Most likely. Possible. One thing many of you already know, OSHA was started in 1970, and about around that time, a lot of the permissible exposure limits were set for chemicals. So a lot of that data is really old. And since then, a lot of other organizations have done studies and said, you know what, we think the limit should be much more strict than OSHA. And in fact, here in North Carolina, we tried to set our own stricter limits in North Carolina. We tried to be stricter than federal a number of years ago, and that all ended up being shot down because we didn't have all the supporting studies to support those numbers. But if you're looking at a safety data sheet for a chemical and you see a permissible exposure limit, let's say it's 50 parts per million is the PEL, and you see a TLV, it says 10 parts per million. That would kind of bother me that one is way more stricter than the other. That might imply that the OSHA standard the OSHA limit needs to be updated, because more modern data show that the level should be lower. And if you work for a very good organization that's very strict and want to do the very best thing, and you want to go way beyond OSHA, your organization is going to control things to the strictest limit that you know of. So those are the kind of places I used to work. They were best practice facilities, and 2 of them are Carolina Star facilities. But we didn't. I had a case years ago. I worked in an antibiotic plant, and we had that alcohol scenario. It wasn't in our product, but it was in the process. And what we did is we put some better engineering controls in place to prevent any symptoms. And we already knew that we're below the OSHA limit. So as far as compliance is concerned, look at the PEL. At least pay attention to these other limits. Now, IDLH, most of us know it's immediately dangerous to life and health. So if you have a dangerous atmosphere that can cause almost immediate fatalities or permanent damage to people, that's called IDLH. And in our business, we can see that pretty easily in a permit required confined space. Somebody's going underground and they're overcome by hydrogen sulfide gas, carbon monoxide, some of those. So be aware that there are some limits to exposures to many of these chemicals that are IDLH. So if you're doing monitoring and you're getting IDLH numbers, and certainly you're not going to put people in that area because you're not going to survive. So that's IDLH. And PELs, permissible exposure limits for these chemicals, is typically an 8-hour average. And for some of these chemicals, there will also be a stale limit, STEL, short-term exposure limit, that's for a 15-minute average. And then there could be a ceiling limit. So if I'm looking at a chemical and there's an 8-hour limit, a 15-minute limit, and a ceiling, then I'm thinking, this is probably pretty dangerous stuff. I've got to be looking at 3 things. Now, I have talked for a long time so far. Let me stop right now and see if any of you have questions or comments. If you don't, we'll be good to go. Let me know if you're okay, or do you have any questions or comments at this time? Okay, Burns, okay. Okay. So if you have a question or comment, I want you to speak up. Don't be shy. So let's keep going. I usually stop for questions before now, but I kind of got going, got on a roll there. Okay. And we must admit, this is really, really dry material. Okay, I got a question. From Keith? What concerns do you have about cured isocyanate? Now, first of all, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not a world expert on isocyanates, but I will tell you this. Like when spray foam insulation is sprayed on the wall, I mean, there's certainly a lot of exposure there. But once it's cured out, not knowing any more than I do right now, I would not personally have any concerns about it at all. Once it's cured, there shouldn't be any hazard there. Now, that's also true. We were talking about formaldehyde a while ago. People that make cabinets and wood products and all, they have certain periods of time that those products have to kind of sit and degas before they're issued to the public. Carpets. And you know, there have been cases in the past where homeowners have been exposed to formaldehyde because these companies would ship this product out before it should have been shipped out or before it had been degassed. And I must admit, I've experienced that as a consumer as well. When the second apartment I ever lived in years ago, was a brand new apartment, they put those cabinets in there. They had not been degassed, and I know it was formaldehyde. But if you got these materials, they're cured, I don't have any concerns. Now, if we have experts out there that know more than that, please chime in, but I don't have any concerns about that at all. Okay, now, if you're in your OSHA standard book, 1910.1000, you'll see 3 tables there. You'll see table Z1, Z2, and you'll see table Z3 for mineral dust. So we're going to speak just for a minute about that. These are places you would go to look at for exposure limits to some of these elements or chemicals. And one thing I will tell you, if you're in a special industry like pharmaceutical industry, where special and unique compounds are created, most of the time in pharmaceuticals, you're not going to go to a Z table and see our active ingredient listed there. So in that industry, what they have to do is at corporate, they have to have industrial hygienist and toxicologist. The company has to actually develop its own permissible exposure limit because OSHA has no idea. I mean, OSHA is not familiar with some of these compounds that have just been created essentially in a research environment. So if you're working in a pharmaceutical plant, you might not be able to open the OSHA standard and see your active ingredient for your product listed in that one of those tables. Okay. Now here's an example of table Z1, and you see substance, and like for acetone, Now there are a lot of laboratories. Most laboratories probably, if it's a chemistry lab, they probably have acetone in there that they use for something. No, we used to use a lot of acetone. So, and sometimes you need to know the synonyms to look something up in an OSHA table. Now, so in the table it says acetone, but it may be listed dimethyl ketone or 2-propanone. Like I said, you see those synonyms there, like we talk about in safety. People that lay brick and clean brick, they use muriatic acid. Muriatic, that's a synonym for hydrochloric acid. So just be familiar with synonyms because you might look something up and not find it, just like the hydrofluoric acid. You're going, I can't find it. It's hydrogen fluoride in the table. Okay, so you got your substance name, and then you got your CAS number, your chemical abstracts service number. This is a standardized international number to identify that chemical. It's almost like a foreign language. Acetone is also known as 67-64-1. Like people that, if there's an accident or whatever, an accident's called in, we got CS number with this number, they know it's acetone. Either way, that identifies acetone. And for exposure, you'll typically see parts per million, parts of vapor or gas per million parts of air by volume, or milligrams per cubic meter. How many milligrams of this substance per every cubic meter of air that the employee breathes? That's the limit. Okay, we got Matthew saying something here. If a sensitization has occurred for isocyanates, very low exposures below levels of attack. Yes, that's true. Okay. Now, I will say, for those of you who would like to study this further, WorkSafe BC, which is in Canada, they have a lot of great videos. Look at their video for isocyanates. It shows somebody spraying foam insulation and it shows the health effects. So what you got to do is you have to overexpose somebody to sensitize them. And then after that, like Matthew says, after that, you're going to be sensitized where very low exposures can cause big issues. So that's a great and true statement that Matthew just made. Okay, like I said, milligrams per cubic meter of air breathed by the employee. And these are typically for an 8-hour average. Now, if you have a company and you're sampling somebody for exposure, and say they work an 8-hour shift, the IH is putting an air sampling pump on the employee, and it has a hose and a cartridge near the breathing zone, and that employee is going to wear that thing all day long. They're going to wear it to break. They're going to wear it at lunchtime. They're going to wear it in the exposure area, and then say for milligrams per cubic meter, the cartridge is taken off and sent to a lab for analysis. So that's a total average of their whole work day. Skin, we've talked about skin designation. So if you worked in a plant that manufactures cigarettes, like I said, and you have employee exposure to nicotine, there's a problem with direct skin contact. And of course, the medical people know that, so that's one reason they have those patches. So if you're a smoker and you want to quit smoking, they know that it can be absorbed easily through the skin. So I don't know if there's a prescription or not. I don't know, but however you get those patches, that's how that nicotine is delivered through the skin. Okay, ceiling values are instantaneous amounts to never exceed. And 15-minute values are averages for 15-minute, So that's pretty straightforward. Table Z2, we got benzene here. We've talked a little bit about benzene today. 8-hour time-weighted average. Now, this is where it can get a bit confusing. Now, this is where the OSHA standard could be a little bit more clear. We don't like the way it says acceptable sealing concentration, acceptable sealing 25, because to the right it says acceptable maximum peak. So that's where you got to get your industrial hygienist involved, because it's going to confuse most people. They said, if I can only go to 25, how can I ever be allowed to go to 50 instantaneously? So what that is 25 is the peak within a 15-minute period, and 50 is the maximum within 10 minutes. So it gets really crazy and complicated when you're doing sampling for benzene. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that. How can I change this number for a 10-hour shift? Change the number. Well, you can. That's something you would have to work through. I mean, what I would do is I would contact an IH. I mean, that's more of a calculation type thing, because when you run over a shift or you run under a shift, you can have equivalents to TWA8, and I would contact your IH person. So Jessica, if you're actually running into that, what I would do, we have a industrial hygienist standards officer here. I would call that question in if you have a specific example, because you have to get it into adjustments there to the equivalent. You're trying to equivalate that to an actual 8-hour number. And let me just use a noise example. Let's say you got noise, you got a permissible exposure limit of 90 decibels for a shift for 8 hours. If you look in the OSHA standard, you can't expose somebody to 115 decibels, but 15 minutes. So 15 minutes at 115 decibel is equivalent to 8-hour 90. So yours is kind of like a chemical example. It has to be calculated. It has to be calculated. Yeah. So I don't know that I answered your question at all, but we do have a certified industrial hygienist standards officer. So if we want to really get deep and complicated beyond what I know, I would call our number. Let's see, our present number. We're getting ready to change our numbers. 919-807-2875. I would call that number and work through that with our industrial hygienist that's on phone duty. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and skip that. Now this slide here, you're welcome. This slide is out of date and it needs to be revised. But let me tell you something that's interesting. If you go to OSHA.gov and you pull up Subpart Z and you pull up Table Z3, it's still there. But the permissible exposure limit for crystalline silica is, what is it now? Any of you remember what that is? I may have already told you. What is the permissible exposure limit for crystalline silica? Does anybody know? Well, what it is, okay, Matthew, correct. Matthew's our star student today. 50 micrograms per cubic meter. Now if you look at one of those formulas there, in the past, your exposure limit was based on the percentage of silica, crystalline silica in your product. So if it was 100% crystalline silica, it was still about 5 times less strict than the current standard. So I wouldn't worry too much about this slide because the federal OSHA standard is out of date. The general industry silica standard now is in effect for industry, so they're going to have to update that pretty soon. But with silica, you have crystalline silica. It's the silica that looks like it has defined shape, kind of like diamonds, little particles. Amorphous silica is like dirt. Then there's no defined shape, and we have exposure limits for both types. But crystalline silica is the most dangerous because it's the one that can be breathed into the deepest part of your lung and scar the lung. So anyway, again, how do you get the OSHA standards book? Okay, that's a good question. nclabor.gov, you can go to our website and order it. You can see how to order it. And what you'll do is you'll call it in and order the standards book from us. And if you order it from us, we also include the North Carolina standards just for North Carolina in the front of the book. You don't have to buy it from us. You can buy it from the publishers as well. There are a lot of different places to get it, but typically it doesn't cost as much from us as it does from the publisher. But you can buy those from us. 1910 for general industry, 1926 for construction. Okay, that's mineral dust. Let's keep moving forward. We've already talked about the hierarchy and controls. So in a workplace, you want to stay up there at the top. You would like to eliminate, engineer out the controls. The further you go down, the more you're depending on people following procedures and wearing equipment properly. Okay, Will has another great question. Is the latest edition the 2017 January? Now that's the edition that we typically sell here. We'll buy our stock for the year and we'll mail them out. But Mancom, M-A-N-C-O-M-M, our publisher, I know they publish a January 1 and I'm pretty sure a July 1st edition. So you, technically speaking, next week, in fact, next week you probably, if you order direct from Mancom, you can get a more later edition than what we have here. And what's funny about the books themselves, they can go out of date in any moment because anytime OSHA standards changed, then the printed books are not up to date. So if you want to know the latest information, always go to the OSHA website. That's a living document. But even on the living document, that table that I was just talking about needs to be updated. So with Mancom, there's also other publishers besides Mancom. Mancom, I think, has 2 published dates. Other publishers may have more. So with Mancom, until next week, the latest edition might be January, well, actually January 28, 2018. Yeah, I just saw the 2017. So the answer would be no for 2017. January 2018 until July, we'll still have January ones throughout the year to sell, but you can bypass us and go somewhere else and get a more later edition if you'd like. Okay. All right. Very important slide. What that says is if you have a company and they're exposed to, thanks for putting the link there, that's great. We want you to engineer out the problem. And we don't want people wearing a bunch of personal protective equipment if it's easy to engineer or proceduralize things so people don't get overexposed. But it says if you can't do that, and if you're doing the best you can, you got air handlers and barriers and all kinds of different things, and you can't get that level down, then it says then you have to put people in personal protective equipment such as respirators And then when you get into respirators, you need to have access to somebody that knows their stuff about respirators as far as um, putting you in the right one, because they have different protection factors. And respiratory protection is a huge topic. Again, if you have people in respirators, there's a lot to do there. But like I said, that's a very important slide. So if OSHA came in and they did an inspection and they saw that it would be easy to engineer out the hazard, they would expect that instead of making people wear PPE. Because most people, I mean, I've never met too many people that said, I worked all day and I really enjoyed wearing that respirator. I really enjoyed wearing it. They might not enjoy wearing it, but they need to wear it to keep them from being overexposed. Okay, we're to methylene chloride. So if you got a reg book, I mean, if you want to, you can turn to 1910.1052 methylene chloride. And when we go through methylene chloride, like I said, you can just see in the book, you know, the same thing we have on our slides. So we know that this is a solvent, and in North Carolina especially, we'll see it a lot in the furniture industries or refinishing industries where they're stripping furniture, and like I said, spray adhesives, and it metabolizes to carbon monoxide in the body, which essentially concerned about hypoxia, which means you're starving the body of oxygen. And there are possible carcinogens, and it can come in through the skin or respiratory system. So, you know, it's pretty dangerous stuff. I tell people if there's an OSHA standard for something, I might be concerned about it if I've got it in my workplace, if they have an entire OSHA standard for it. Now, here it talks about affecting the heart, nervous system, liver, eyes, skin, and it's a possible carcinogen. We're not going to talk a lot about carcinogens today. We could really get sidetracked on that. And this is how the standard is laid out. Anytime you go to an OSHA standard, make sure you look at the scope. Is this within the scope of the standard, or are we excluded? What does this apply to? The definitions, the exposure limits. So, like I said there for methylene chloride, you're going to see your permissible exposure limit in there as well. And so you're going to find the numbers in there. And I could have you looking those up, but I'm not too worried about it. Most of you can look up what the number is in the standard. How do you monitor for exposure? Where you do have exposure areas, how do you regulate those areas? How do you keep people out of there that don't need to be in there? It's like if you're removing asbestos from a building, from a room, and you have people in protective equipment in that room, you got to have a way to keep people out. Same as methylene chloride. If you got an exposure area, the people in there are protected, the people out of there need to stay out. You need to put up certain signs. All that detail is in the regulation. How do you comply? Are respirators required? Now, when you look in methylene chloride, they talk about respirators, and this is interesting to me. I'm looking at it right now. However, employees must not select or use half masks of any type because methylene chloride may cause eye irritation or damage. So even though the half face may protect your breathing enough, it's not protecting your eyes. So if OSHA went out and inspected and people wearing half-face respirators, there would be most likely a citation there. That you need like a full face would protect your eyes, full face respirator versus half face. What protective clothing and equipment to wear, and do you have to have special hygiene facilities? You have to have change areas, showers, those kind of things. That's hygiene. Medical surveillance. Many of these standards say that if you have people that work with this particular substance, they may require pre-screening. You might some of these things require, in some cases, blood work or whatever to make sure that people are at a safe level, or surveillance. They may do some kind of X-ray or breathing test, spirometry, and then monitor the employee, on a periodic basis to make sure that they're not medically going out of bounds to where they need to be removed from that type of work. Hazard communication, as far as it being a chemical, what do you have to cover with your training? How often does it need to be done? What kind of records do we need to keep? And the appendices that are required, well, actually, the appendices that are offered for people to use that have those situations where they're actually using methylene chloride. Now, like I said in class, if we were in an actual classroom today versus a webinar and everybody had their books, I would probably have you look up those numbers and tell me what methylene chloride requires. I just want you to be able to look it up. And when you go through there, the way it's laid out, you'll look at lead and silica and a lot of those, and they're laid out in a similar fashion. Again, we're talking about a massive part of the reg book that, like I said, we're just giving you a high-level look at today. All right. Sorry about people that had sound issues. If you had major sound issues or anything that caused you from receiving the proper webinar as far as the slides and sound, please contact us. In fact, for technical issues, of course, you can contact Webinato if you'd like to, because we run off of their server. But Dee Bryant, D-E-E, and her last name is Bryant, B-R-Y-A-N-T. D-E-E, and her last name is Bryant, B-R-Y-A-N-T, is at 919-807-2877. So if you have major issues, we'd like to know. And like I said at the beginning, some of you have mobile devices like cell phones, even though there's an app for that. Sometimes cell phones can't see the PowerPoint slides. Sometimes cell phones have audio problems. Sometimes tablets have the same thing. So we always recommend with this tool, at least right now, to use computers. So if you had a mobile device today and had no problem, good. But sometimes people have those problems and we say just get out and get back in. And sorry about the sound issues. Okay, so we talked about a lot today about these substances, where to find information, some of these terms, and the subpart Z as a whole. What I'm going to do at this time is I've got 11:19. Right now I'm going to call this as being the end of the webinar, 11:19. So those of you who are good to go, you're welcome to leave now. And for those who want to stay for a few minutes, I'll stay on here for just a few minutes in case you have any more comments. But again, I enjoyed you guys being here today. Hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions, call our office. They'll shift you over to a standards officer. You're all welcome. Like I said, it's a very dry subject. It's one of the driest ones, so hopefully we didn't have any fatalities from listening to this. Right now, nobody's been killed by webinars yet. Hopefully it won't happen. But anyway, you're all welcome. And we have some great, smart people out there on the webinar. I think we had a few experts out there. And you're all welcome. So right here in just a few minutes, I'll be logging off. So like I said, you're free to go ahead and log off right now. You're welcome. So I'll be here just for another couple of minutes.
Don't miss the anniversary sale at Albertsons and Tom Thumb going on now. Great low prices on the things your whole family will love. Look for qualifying tags in store to soak up all the savings at Albertsons and Tom Thumb. Head in store and shop the anniversary sale today.
While I'm winding down, we take no responsibility for this advertising. So anyway, looks like nobody has any questions. Okay, Josh. Joshua, as long as you log in 80% of the time, we'll be good. Okay? That's what we have to go by. Sorry about the technical issue. All right, looks like I don't have any additional Okay, the certificates. You should receive your certificates. They'll be emailed to you within 3 weeks electronically. Okay? Electronic certificates. Okay? And for those of you who didn't have audio, I have no idea.
Gear up for Back to Sport at Academy
Okay,
Sports and Outdoors during Texas's tax-free weekend, August 9th through August 11th. All gear, all weekend, all tax-free. And now through Saturday, save 25% on select Nike and Under Armour